Be me, Nathan, 34, systems analyst for a logistics company. My job is mostly finding where things break before they break loudly. Quiet work, clean spreadsheets, predictable problems. I like predictable problems. Machines do not ask you to apologize for how their malfunction made them feel. Married to Claire for 4 years. She was 32, worked in communications for a large nonprofit, and when I met her, she had this focused warmth that made every room feel sharper. She listened like she was actually collecting the details, not waiting to talk, not performing interest, actually listening. That was the thing that got me. I had dated women who liked the idea of a calm man but hated the reality of one. Claire seemed different. She said my steadiness made her feel safe. She said she loved that I could talk about difficult things without turning them into a fight. For the first couple of years, I believed her. We had a decent apartment, matching schedules, small Sunday rituals, coffee on the balcony, grocery runs where she bought expensive olives and I pretended not to notice the price, dinner with friends twice a month, a life that felt ordinary in the best possible way. Then Claire started spending more time with a group from work. It began as a book club, then it became a support circle, then it became, in her words, a space for deconstructing relational labor under patriarchy. I remember the first time she used that phrase at dinner. I was cutting chicken on a wooden board and she said, "Do you understand how much emotional labor women are expected to perform in marriage?" I said, "I think so, but tell me what you mean." That was apparently the correct answer. She smiled like I had passed a small entrance exam. For a while, I tried to engage with it sincerely. I read the articles she sent. I listened to the podcast episodes. I asked questions. I was not hostile. I was not threatened. I just thought my wife had found a language for things she cared about. But slowly, the language stopped describing our marriage and started replacing it. Normal conversations became audits. If I asked whether she was upset, I was making her manage my anxiety. If I gave her space, I was emotionally withholding. If I offered a solution, I was centering male problem solving. If I listened quietly, I was forcing her to carry the conversation. There was no neutral option. Every possible response had a charge attached to it. The first major incident happened after my father had a minor stroke. Minor is a strange word for something that makes your mother call at 2:13 in the morning. He survived. He recovered well. But for a week, everything in me felt misaligned. I was functioning, going to work, making calls, updating family members, handling insurance forms. Then one night I sat at the kitchen table and told Claire I was scared. Not dramatically, not sobbing into my hands, just honest. I said, seeing him like that made me realize how fast everything can change. She looked up from her laptop with a tired expression. Then she sighed, not the concerned kind, the burdened kind. She said, "Nathan, I need you to understand that I cannot be your emotional dumping ground." I just stared at her. She continued, using that careful workshop voice she had started using at home. She said men are socialized to outsource emotional regulation to women. She said wives become unpaid therapists because men refuse to build support networks. She said my fear was valid, but it was not her job to process it for me. I remember the exact feeling in my chest, not anger, more like a drawer closing. I said, "Okay." She softened a little when she realized I was not going to argue. She said she appreciated my willingness to learn. Then she suggested I journal about it, so I did. Not because she suggested it, because I needed somewhere to put things that were no longer welcome in my own marriage. I bought a black notebook from an office supply store. On the first page, I wrote the date and one sentence. Dad had a stroke and Claire said my fear was labor. That became the beginning of my spreadsheet approach. I did not call it evidence at first. I called it orientation. When you live inside a fog, you start marking trees so you can find the road back. Over the next 3 months, I documented every emotional interaction that ended with me being corrected for having one. Date, topic, what I said, what she said, outcome. I did not exaggerate. I did not editorialize. I used direct quotes whenever I could remember them. March 11th, work stress about restructuring. I said, I might lose 2 people from my team and I feel responsible. Claire said, this sounds like leadership guilt, but I don't have capacity to absorb masculine provider anxiety tonight. Outcome, conversation ended. March 18th, nightmare about my father falling. I said, I had a bad dream and woke up shaken. Claire said, I need sleep, Nathan, and I need you to self-soothe instead of waking me to regulate you. Outcome, slept on couch. March 29th, anniversary dinner. I said, I miss feeling close to you. Claire said, closeness cannot mean me becoming your emotional caretaker. Outcome, silent car ride home. The notebook filled faster than I expected. That was the first frightening part. The second frightening part was how calm I became while filling it. A man can get used to a surprising amount of cold weather if he stops expecting the sun. Claire's best friend Mara was a major influence in all this. Mara had a podcast microphone, a divorce, and the kind of certainty that only people with ruined lives seem comfortable selling. She called marriage a historically gendered service contract. She called husbands emotional landlords. She called male vulnerability a backdoor attempt to access women's unpaid care. Claire would come home from drinks with Mara glowing with new vocabulary. Then our apartment would get colder. One Saturday, Claire hosted 3 women from her circle in our living room. I made coffee, set out pastries, and planned to stay in my office. But as I walked past the hallway, I heard my name. Mara was saying, men love weaponizing sadness because it sounds softer than control. Then Claire laughed. Not nervously, not reluctantly. She laughed because she agreed. She said, Nathan has been doing this thing lately where he tells me he's overwhelmed and waits for me to comfort him. Mara said, classic. Another woman said, they call it vulnerability when they want a woman to do the repair work. I stood there holding an empty mug and felt something very clean move through me. It was not humiliation. It was data. I went back to my office and wrote it down. April 6th, overheard Claire describe my grief and work stress as a strategy. Outcome, public ridicule in private home. That night, she came into the bedroom cheerful and kissed my cheek. She asked why I had been so quiet. I almost told her. The old version of me would have tried. He would have explained that being mocked hurt. He would have hoped she saw the cruelty of it. He would have believed that if he found the perfect sentence, the woman he married would return. Instead, I said, just tired. She frowned. She said, I hope you're not withdrawing as a punishment. I said, no. That was true. Punishment requires wanting the other person to learn. I was past that. The final switch happened 2 weeks later. My company announced a reorganization. Not layoffs exactly, but close enough to make every manager in the building stop sleeping normally. I came home late. Claire was on the couch watching a video about emotional equity in domestic partnerships. I told her another had just bought a house. I said, I know it's business, but I feel sick about it. She rubbed her forehead. Then she said, Nathan, I need you to ask for consent before unloading heavy emotions on me. I nodded slowly. She continued. She said, I am your wife, but I am not your free therapist. She said, this is exactly what Mara talks about. She said, men need to stop confusing intimacy with access. That sentence landed with surgical precision. Men need to stop confusing intimacy with access. I looked at my wife, the woman who had once told me my steadiness made her feel safe. I realized she did not want a husband with an inner life. She wanted a pleasant roommate who paid half the bills, fixed the router, attended weddings, and kept his fear in a container where it could not inconvenience her. So I gave her exactly that. I said, understood. She looked relieved. She thought we had reached a healthy boundary. In a way we had. Just not the boundary she thought. The next morning I stopped sharing, completely, not dramatically, not with slammed doors or pointed silence. I became operational. Good morning, coffee is made. Trash goes out tonight. Your dry cleaning is in the hall closet. Dinner is in the fridge. Everything useful remained. Everything human disappeared. If work was stressful, I said it was fine. If my father had a follow-up appointment, I handled it and said it went fine. If I woke from another nightmare, I sat in the living room until my breathing slowed and said nothing. Claire noticed within 4 days. At first, she seemed pleased. She called it growth. She said she could feel the emotional load shifting off her shoulders. She said our home felt less heavy. I smiled and said, "Good." I meant it. The home did feel less heavy, for me, because I had stopped carrying hope through it. Then week 2 arrived. She asked how my meeting with senior leadership went. I said, "Fine." She asked whether I was worried about the restructure. I said, "It's being handled." She asked whether my dad's medication had changed. I said, "Yes." She waited. I did not continue. She blinked. She said, "And?" I said, "He's following the doctor's instructions." She looked annoyed. She said, "Nathan, I'm asking because I care." That was the first crack. I looked at her calmly and said, "I know." Then I went back to washing the pan. Week 3 was when she started fishing. She would sit beside me on the couch and ask open-ended questions. "How are you really? What's been on your mind lately? Do you feel connected to me?" The questions were perfectly shaped. A year earlier, I would have walked straight into them. Now I answered like a weather report. "I'm fine, nothing major. Connection seems stable." She hated that one. She said, "Connection seems stable." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's such a clinical thing to say." I almost laughed. Clinical was the only language left that was safe. Claire began accusing me of being passive-aggressive. I asked what behavior she meant specifically. She said, "This." I said, "You'll need to be more specific." She said, "The way you're not telling me anything." I said, "You asked me to stop using you for emotional labor." She flinched. Not much, just enough. She said, "That's not what I meant." I dried my hands on a towel. I said, "Then what did you mean?" She opened her mouth. Nothing coherent came out. Because what she meant was simple. She wanted the authority to reject my feelings without losing the access to them. She wanted to be needed without being burdened. She wanted the power of intimacy without the responsibility of care, but she could not say that. So she said, "You're twisting my words." I nodded. "Okay." That word became my shield. Okay, not agreement, not surrender. Just a period at the end of a conversation that no longer deserved a paragraph. By the end of the month, Claire was visibly unsettled. She started bringing me tea while I worked. She started touching my shoulder when she passed behind my chair. She started asking whether I wanted to go for walks. These were things she had once called bids for unpaid attention when I did them. Now they were attempts to check whether the machine still had a pulse. I went on the walks. I drank the tea. I thanked her politely. I gave her nothing she could hold. The strangest part was how peaceful my life became. I started talking to other people again. My brother, my old college friend Marcus, a therapist I found through my insurance, because apparently paying someone made my emotions legitimate. I told the therapist the whole thing, not in a flood, in sequence, like an incident report. She listened quietly, then asked, "What do you want from Claire now?" I sat there for a long time. Then I said, "I don't know if I want anything from her." That answer scared me more than any fight could have. Claire sensed it. People always sense when control leaves the room. One Friday, I came home and found her waiting at the kitchen table. No laptop, no podcast, no Mara on speakerphone. Just Claire, sitting with red eyes and a mug she had not touched. She said, "We need to talk." I put my keys in the bowl. I said, "Okay." She said, "I feel like you're shutting me out." I said, "I have reduced emotional disclosure to respect your boundaries." Her face tightened. She said, "Can you not talk like you're writing a report?" I said, "I'm being clear." She said, "You're being cruel." There it was, the accusation she had been building toward. I sat across from her. I kept my hands folded on the table. She said she felt lonely. She said she missed us. She said she missed knowing what was going on inside my head. She said marriage requires vulnerability. I let her speak. I did not interrupt. When she finished, she looked at me with the expression of someone waiting for a door to open. I said, I agree that marriage requires vulnerability. Hope flashed across her face. Then I continued, I no longer believe this marriage is a safe place for mine. The hope disappeared. She whispered, Why would you say that? I stood up, went to my office, and came back with the black notebook. I placed it on the table between us. She looked at it like it was a weapon. It was not a weapon, it was a mirror. I opened to the first page. I read the line about my father. Then I read the work entry, then the nightmare, then the anniversary dinner, then the day her friends laughed in our living room. I kept my voice even. No drama, no performance, just dates, quotes, outcomes. After the seventh entry, she said, Stop. I stopped. She was crying, not loudly, just tears sliding down her face as the system she had built started producing results she did not like. She said, You were documenting me? I said, I was documenting reality. She said, That's so cold. I said, Yes. Then I looked at her and said the sentence I had been forming for weeks. Cold is what happens when warmth becomes evidence of unpaid labor. She covered her mouth. I continued, You taught me that my fear was labor. You taught me that my grief was labor. You taught me that my stress was labor. You taught me that needing comfort from my wife was a form of extraction. So I stopped extracting. I tapped the notebook once. You got exactly the marriage you described as fair. She shook her head. I wanted balance. No, I said. You wanted control over when my humanity was convenient. That one broke through. I could see it. Her posture changed. The argument left her shoulders. For the first time in months, she looked less like someone defending a theory and more like someone seeing a person. Too late, but still. She said, I didn't know you felt this alone. I looked at her for a long moment. Claire, I told you. Her face crumpled, because she knew I had. Not once, not vaguely, not in hints. I had told her plainly, repeatedly, carefully, and each time she had corrected the format of my pain instead of responding to it. She reached across the table for my hand. I moved mine back, not sharply, just enough. She stared at the empty space between us. That empty space explained more than I could. She said, Please don't do this. I said, I'm not doing anything tonight. That was true. The decision had already been made quietly, weeks earlier, in therapy, in my car outside the hospital, in the guest room at 3 a.m., in all the small places where men become single before anyone notices. I told her I had spoken to an attorney. I told her I was not filing immediately, but I was preparing. I told her I would consider counseling if she arranged it, attended it without Mara's commentary, and stopped using ideology as a substitute for accountability. She nodded too quickly. She said yes to everything. People do that when they realize the door is not locked from their side. For 2 weeks she tried. I will give her that. She booked counseling, she apologized, she cried. She sent Mara fewer messages. She asked about my father and listened to the answer, but something had shifted in me beyond repair. Her kindness felt like someone returning stolen furniture after the house had burned down. Useful, maybe, but not home. In our second counseling session, the therapist asked Claire what she thought happened. Claire said, I think I pathologized his need for connection. That was the cleanest sentence she had said in months. Then the therapist asked me what I felt hearing that. I looked at Claire. I wanted to feel relief. I wanted the sentence to matter. But all I felt was the calm absence of expectation. I said, I believe she understands it now. Claire started crying because she heard the missing part. Understanding was not the same as repair. A month later, I filed. No big scene, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. I left the papers on the kitchen table after we had already discussed the logistics. Claire sat down slowly when she saw them. She touched the corner of the folder like it might disappear. She said, So that's it? I said yes. She said, after everything, you can just walk away. I almost corrected her. After everything was exactly why I could walk away. Instead, I said, I am not walking away from one conversation. I am walking away from a pattern. She nodded, crying quietly. There was no villain speech, no final insult, no triumphant music. Just two people in a quiet kitchen, one of them finally understanding the cost of winning arguments against someone who only wanted to be loved. I moved into a smaller apartment across town. My father kept recovering. Work stabilized. Marcus helped me carry boxes and made one joke about my label maker being evidence of a diseased mind. The first night alone, I sat on the floor eating takeout from a cardboard container. No one asked me to justify my tone. No one graded my sadness. No one called my silence abusive or my words labor. The quiet felt clean. A few months later, Claire sent a message, not a long one. She said she had been thinking about the notebook. She said she finally understood that intimacy was not just physical. She said she had treated my inner life like an invoice she refused to pay. She said she was sorry. I read it twice. Then I wrote back, I hope you keep understanding that. Nothing more. Because sometimes the lesson arrives after the student has left the classroom. I do not hate Claire. That would require carrying her around with me. I simply learned the rule she taught me better than she expected. If my feelings are labor, I will stop assigning her the work. If my vulnerability is extraction, I will stop giving her access. If my pain is a burden, I will carry it somewhere safer. She wanted a husband who stopped making emotional demands. She got one. Then she panicked when she realized those demands were also the last remaining proof that I still trusted her. And once trust goes quiet, it does not always come back when called.